Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our stories of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we're dealing with the second portion of our story of the final Spanish period. Episode number 1, of course, having dealt with the transfer of flags from the British to the Spanish, and then the 10-year episode during which Alexander McGillivray was the chief of the Creeks and began the famous fur trade which the Spanish under William Penn and John Leslie operated successfully for so many years. As we move into the 1790s, Penn and Leslie continued to succeed. They built a great mansion down on the waterfront, which was a showplace. They enlarged the trade that they have. They employed more people. It was an extremely successful operation. However, for Spain itself, times were not good, because as we moved into the 1790s, the French Revolution was taking place on the European continent, and this had a very serious effect in Spain. Their trade was disrupted, and of course, before long, we would have an actual invasion of Spain by Napoleon Bonaparte and his armies, and an occupation there which lasted for some years. All of this had an effect here because as those things were happening in Spain, there was much less in the way of manpower or other resources, particularly economic resources, coming to help the governor. By now, our first Spanish governor, Arturo O'Neill, had left. He had now been succeeded by Governor Juan Folch, and Juan Folch would be with us for roughly 13 years. And that's the way things proceeded through the balance of this decade, coming into the beginning of the 19th century. And as we came to the end of the 1700s, John Leslie and William Penn had grown old. They both, one retired, the other left, and unfortunately died shortly after his departure from here. But they had been most successful, and now they turned very systematically turned their wonderful operation, first of all, over to two nephews named Thomas and James Forbes, who in turn were followed very shortly by two other nephews of William Penn, John and James Innerarity. And these men came in the names Forbes and Innerarity, thus become an integral part of the economic history of Pensacola up to the end of this final Spanish period. Well, as this is going on, of course, the town itself is growing slowly. Ranching has developed out north of the city. Manuel Gonzalez has developed a beautiful spread about where the little community of Gonzalez is in present day 21st century. But other things than that are growing very slowly. And then we come to a period, as the governor said, we've got to be more systematic. We don't trust some of the records we have. Now, bear in mind, we are still in the year 1800. We are still operating under the survey that had been made of Pensacola back in 1764 by the engineer Elias Durnford. And Governor Folch said he wanted to redo that, and so he engaged a young man by the name of Vicente Pintado to be the surveyor and to redo the entire study of Pensacola. And he did. And about halfway through his studies, he did something that was rather unusual. Vicente Pintado recognized, and why he thought this, of course, we will never know. He felt that someday the city was going to want more waterfront property. And so there was a possibility of building new land or doing something of that kind. I have no idea what he really thought, but his concept was this. He went to Governor Folch and he said, look, instead of paying me for my work in gold, why don't you give me the riparian rights to the area here from Little Bayou, that's Bayou Chico, going east all the way to Bayou Tahar or Lake Tahar. That would be about 600 feet from the present land edge out into the water. And also I want 600 arpents, about 900 acres, off of what we today call Town Point. Well, the governor looked at Vicente Pintado and said, this man's been out in the sun too long. Why would he want to do that? But the governor, of course, instead of handing over that much gold, he said, fine. So they wrote out the papers, and Pintado proceeded that way. Just a year later, the Spanish began to have trouble with the cemetery. Now, the cemetery for the city had been laid out originally by the British on the west side of what we today call Spring Street. It was a creek running down in that area, but the cemetery had been there very close to the water, and by now, in the early part of the 1800s, storms and wave action was causing problems within that cemetery. And so the governor asked Mr. Pintado to do another survey, this on the east side of the city, to lay out a new cemetery. Cemetery. The plan was sent to the Royal Council in Madrid. They approved it, and so it was then that St. Michael's Cemetery came into being. As it was laid out, originally it had 28 acres, but a little bit later on, the Spanish felt, well, we don't need that much land, and so some of it was sold off. And today, St. Michael's Cemetery is still in the same place it was back then, of course, but there's only about 8 acres instead of the original 28. Well, we move into the early part of the 1800s, and now another very dramatic event takes place. Napoleon Bonaparte, meanwhile, has invaded Spain, and his brother Joseph now sits on the Spanish throne. And as this goes on, Napoleon may, this is one of those situations where we really can't be certain what his intentions were, but he may have had in his mind the idea of attacking from that point and establishing French rule over the entire southeastern United States. But whatever the reason, he soon gave up that idea, recognizing that as his wars proceeded in Europe, the British were becoming very active, and he was concerned now that the British might step into this area and perhaps take a new claim on what had been Spanish Florida. So Napoleon first took over the entire Spanish area to the west. That is what we today call Louisiana. He took it over and claimed that now not for Spain but for France. And after a year or so, he realized that there was a real hazard of the British coming, and so he turned around and offered this huge uncharted area all to the United States. And so negotiations began between the French and President Thomas Jefferson, and in 1803 we completed what we today call the Louisiana Purchase, in which the United States paid $15 million to France and got this huge territory moving from the Mississippi west into areas which, of course, no one had explored. We had no idea what it was, but Mr. Jefferson had it. Now, at that point, there are some historians who believe that Mr. Jefferson was facing a new idea. He saw that there was continuing to be an encroachment of Georgia and Carolina settlers moving into the Alabama, Mississippi Indian Territory. This was creating more and more violence, more problems, and so Mr. Jefferson may have had the idea of setting aside much larger territories to the west of the Mississippi into which these Indian tribes might be moved. However, he procrastinated, and that never happened. Well, as this being the case, things moved forward a little bit more, and by the time we get into the year 1812, a new element has come to Florida and to local Spanish history, but in 1812, the United States and Great Britain went to war. Now, this was largely a trade war, and people in Pensacola had very little interest in it, but it was there. And of course, as it proceeded over the next year and a half, 2 years, Mr. President Madison and his people were being unsuccessful at practically every turn. They've lost almost all the battles except one on Lake Erie, and things looked extremely dark for the United States. And at this point, in 1814, the British strategy changed slightly. They now determined what they were going to do is to try and get all of the Southeast back by making an attack through Spanish Florida into the southeastern area and retake a land that they had lost in 1781. Now, the plan, of course, was to do this, to come through either Pensacola, Mobile, or maybe New Orleans to make that attack. And as to do this, to set this up, they began to establish British agents who began to work basically in the eastern part of the Panhandle, around St. Mark's, and gradually moved their way west, trying to encourage the Indians to side with them, to trying to encourage black slaves to desert and come to be part of their party. All of this was set up, and we have three men that we need to remember in this. One of them was named George Woodbine. He was a British Army captain. The second one was Colonel Edward Nichols, and the third one was Admiral Charles Cochrane. Now, Cochrane, of course, commanded a naval fleet, and Nichols and Woodbine were putting together all of the positions, the ideas for the strategy of an invasion. Well, of course, as we move toward the middle of 1814, the Spanish are aware of this, and the poor governor is in a very difficult position. He realizes this is wrong, but in Spain, the British have finally succeeded in pushing Napoleon Bonaparte out of their country. And so the Spanish owe the British, and they know it. And the question is now, shall they give the British permission to enter Spanish Florida and attack the United States. Well, it's just kind of a standoff. There's never any document written that says that they can, but then on the other hand, the Spanish took no steps to stop it. So into 1814, the Woodbine and his associate Nichols succeed in stealing horses from the Forbes Company, stealing slaves, getting things set up, and finally the arrangement is made. They occupy a little fortress that is on the outskirts of Mobile, Fortress Boyart, and they are ready to make their invasion. Well, of course, President Madison and his people finally recognize what's happening, and they quickly send an email to Tennessee, where they activate a force under General Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson and his volunteers quickly march south, and they move first toward Mobile, recognizing that the English are there, but not in force. So the British, seeing Andrew Jackson coming, leave there, move east, and occupy portions of Pensacola, especially the old Spanish fort, which was out near where NAS is today. Okay, here comes Andrew Jackson. He had moved to Mobile. Now he's moving towards Spanish Pensacola, and unhappily for the Americans, the British totally overestimate what Jackson's force was. He moves toward the territory. So one of the little interesting, wonderful stories about Andrew Jackson was he's on this march, and of course he's never been here. He has no scouts, and he's moving about 15 miles north of Pensacola, intending then to cut south into the city. And as he does so, he arrives at the farm of Manuel Gonzalez. And there's a young boy out in the courtyard, and Jackson shakes his finger in the boy's mouth and says, "You've got to guide me into Pensacola. I've got to find my way there." And at this point, the boy's father comes out. And he's a small man in stature, and he stands up in front of Andrew Jackson. "You cannot put your force on my son. I will not have it." Well, Jackson, of course, could have very well have acted as he often did in situations like that, but he respected what old Manuel Gonzalez had done, and he said, "I'm sorry, I apologize, but will you allow your son now to guide us?" And so at that point in time, a very strange friendship emerged between Andrew Jackson and Manuel Gonzalez, and we'll come back to that in another episode. Well, indeed, the son guided Jackson south. They come into the area, and of course, now the governor is here. He knows that he must make a show of force. And so Governor Folse sends forth what he called his militia. It was a very small military force. They move out toward Mr. Jackson's oncoming army. A few shots are fired. The Spanish have protected their honor by doing this, and then they surrender. Jackson quickly moves in, and as the British see him coming, they totally overestimate again the force that he's got. The British load their troops onto Admiral Cochrane's ships, and they sail to the west. Well, Jackson has put two and two together, and he realizes what the British intent is, and so he now turns his own force about, and they make a forced march back, bypass Mobile, and they get to the outskirts of New Orleans, to Barataria, where he gains the enlisted help of a pirate, what the right term is, I'm not sure, but anyway, his name was Jean Lafitte, and Lafitte joins Jackson, and they march in, and they set up a defense work on the outskirts of New Orleans. About 3 days later, the British attack begins. They go back and forth and back, several attacks, and the British are totally defeated. Now, of course, the war is technically ended by then. A peace treaty has been agreed to, but Jackson didn't know that, neither did the British. But now what has happened, of course, is Jackson's reputation just soars. The press pick up what he has done, and he becomes a national hero. The British leave, and from our standpoint here, the War of 1812 in Pensacola, at least, had ended. So this is our story, part one of Andrew Jackson in Spanish territory, and of course he will come back to us again in episode number 3. But for that moment, the Spanish are still here, the British have left us, the Americans are on the outskirts, and of course things are beginning to happen now up in the Alabama-Mississippi territory, and that's where episode 3 will begin.